Thank you, Sarah. Well, it's a great honor to be asked to be with you today. I'm also thankful that Congressman Pompeo and several other members and former members of the House are here, and the article that the Congressman and David Rivkin of Foundation for Defense of Democracies put together for the Washington Post very much bears reading, as does Andy McCarthy's superb piece of yesterday. And that's what I'm going to talk about, because there's not much time to talk about more than a couple of things, and these 2 points are crucial. Any negotiation, and I have been either an advisor, a delegate, or ambassador-in-chief negotiator for 5 arms control negotiations over the years. Any negotiation, whether it's arms control or anything else, business, usually there are quid pro quos. There are times spent in which you're trading off this versus that. You say, I could give you a little bit of this, but I need you to do that. There does not seem to have been anything like that in these negotiations. Basically, Iran has agreed to do 2 things, and both are frauds. First, it has agreed that it will be able to get 1/3 of the Senate to back the agreement that it has negotiated, that the administration has negotiated essentially with Iran. And for that 1/3, they will see to it that the agreement can be verified. Now, if that 1/3 sounds strange, it's because it's the product of the way the cloture numbers work. But essentially, if this were a normal treaty, and it is very close to being the sort of thing that ought to be in a treaty, the administration would have to get 2/3 of the Senate, not 1/3 plus 1. That is a total fraud. Now, that means that if 1/3 of the Senate plus 1 goes along with the administration, the way the cloture rules and so forth work, the agreement can become observed and effectively function like a treaty or a piece of legislation. The second thing Iran has agreed to is that in order to get their right to approve the treaty by the Senate, by only a 1/3 of the Senate, what they are going to do is provide lots of details about the way verification is going to work under the treaty. Wow, it's going to be terrific. They're going to give us lots and lots of details. It's just one little point. They're not going to tell us what they are. They've negotiated them. The Iranians have negotiated them with the IADA. And there is essentially no way for the rest of us or the American press to find out what the terms of the agreement are. Now, if on any of those 4 arms control agreements in which I participated negotiating, and let's take the last one, Conventional Forces in Europe, where I was the ambassador-in-chief negotiator, if I had come back from the negotiations in Vienna to call on my boss at the time, Jim Baker, Secretary of State, and said, Secretary, I got good news and bad news. Okay. The good news is that the Russians have agreed to a lot of verification procedures. The bad news is that they're not going to tell us what they are. But they think we ought to go along with them anyway. What do you say? Jim Baker's a pretty blunt guy. He would have punted me out of his office. That might be the kindest thing he would have done. What we cannot have is an arms control agreement in which we don't know the terms. Now, the law as passed by the Congress, the Review Act that was passed 3 months ago, deals with this situation. It says very clearly that not only all terms of the agreement between Iran and the rest of the countries and the United States, not only do those have to be made available to the United States. They have to be made available within 5 days of the signing of the agreement. That would have been July 14th, so they were due by July 19th. And they didn't come. So what happens? That agreement's provisions are null and void. What we have is not a situation in the middle of a 60-day period to get something done. The period never started. There is not an agreement because the statutory terms were not fulfilled. The president is not authorized to go off and negotiate an agreement that violates the law. Now, if the law is observed and the sanctions stay in place, and there's a lot of argument back and forth between Republicans and Democrats, between Iranians and Westerners, back and forth for the next 16 months, all right, so be it. There's argument back and forth. We've seen that. But in terms of obeying the rules under this supposed agreement, there ain't no agreement, ladies and gentlemen. It doesn't exist. It is not there. There is nothing there. When we have a new president, we can start talking and working seriously on this very important set of issues. Thank you very much. I'd be glad to take a couple of questions. Yes.
You've spoken in the past about the dangers of an EMP attack.
Yeah.
If this deal goes through, how do you think Iran would actually test a bomb to announce the? I mean, if the deal goes through, Iran gets the bomb, do you think they would test it to announce to the world they've got it, or would they just eventually launch it surprise you guys?
The question is about electromagnetic pulse. The Earth has been bombarded by electromagnetic pulses for about 4.1 billion years. They come from the sun, magnetized radio waves. And in 1962, just as we were about to move into a world of not permitting nuclear tests in the atmosphere or above the atmosphere with the treaty, both the Russians and the United States discovered that when you detonate a nuclear weapon at very high altitude, say in orbit 20, 30, 50, 70, 100 miles up, the pulse travels, two pulses, travel great long distances and can knock out electronics thousands of miles away. Now, we weren't too vulnerable in 1962 because we mainly had vacuum tubes and the vacuum tubes didn't care. But modern electronics are extremely vulnerable to that, and here's the problem. We got 18 critical infrastructures in the U.S. Food, water, electronic delivery systems, banking, etc. All 17 of the others depend on the electric grid. If the electric grid goes, you are not back in the 1980s pre-web. You're back in the 1880s pre-electricity. And very few of us have enough plow horses and seeds to live in the 19th century. So it is a disastrous thing if someone should utilize a nuclear detonation in orbit to knock out our electric grid. But it is possible. What that means is that any country that has a nuclear weapon and a ballistic missile that can put it into orbit is a serious threat to the United States, and that would include today North Korea, as well as in their own ways, Russia and China. But that would include North Korea, and it would also, once they have a nuclear weapon, which could be most any time now, would include Iran. So I think the current situation makes us quite vulnerable, and we need to deal with the problem of nuclear weapons spread. One thing not to do is to encourage proliferation. And what does this agreement do? It encourages proliferation. It gives the Sunni states of the Middle East a great argument for, in Egypt and in Sudan, in Saudi Arabia, throughout the Middle East. It gives them a reason for matching Shiite Iran by their having nuclear weapons. So the next time we have a crisis in the Middle East, 4 or 5 of the states that are participants in the crisis could well be nuclear powers. That's not likely to be a real stable situation.